I thought I was dreaming when my phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on July 5th. The caller ID showed Mom, which sent ice through my veins because Linda never calls after 9 p.m. unless someone died. I fumbled for the phone in my dark bedroom, still groggy from falling asleep watching Netflix after a long day debugging code at my software development job. Her voice hit me like a freight train, sobbing hysterically, barely forming words between gasps. Something about fire and the cabin and emergency responders and not knowing what to do. My beloved mountain retreat in Colorado, the sanctuary I bought after my divorce 2 years ago to rebuild my life, was apparently burning while I slept peacefully, 300 miles away in Denver. The 4-hour drive to Breckenridge felt like driving through a nightmare that refused to end. Every mile brought fresh waves of anxiety as I replayed Mom's frantic phone call, trying to piece together fragments of information that made no logical sense. She kept saying something about 23 people and breaking in and July 5th celebrations, but nothing connected in any coherent way that my exhausted brain could process. Dawn was breaking over the Rockies when I finally turned down the gravel road leading to my cabin. The first thing I saw was the fire department vehicles still parked along my normally pristine driveway. Red and blue lights cut through the morning mist, painting everything in surreal colors that made the scene feel like something from a disaster movie. My stomach dropped as I caught sight of the cabin itself. The entire left side was blackened and charred. Windows were blown out and I could see straight through what used to be my kitchen into the living room beyond. Smoke still curled lazily from the wreckage, carrying the acrid smell of burned wood and melted plastic. Yellow tape cordoned off the damaged section, and firefighters were still hosing down hot spots that glowed orange in the dim morning light. Fire Chief Rodriguez approached my truck as I sat there stunned, unable to process what I was seeing. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with kind eyes that had clearly seen too many disasters. He explained that a grease fire had started in the kitchen around 10 p.m. the previous evening and spread rapidly to the living area before his crew managed to contain it. The structure was stable, but the damage was extensive. That's when I noticed them. Scattered across my property like refugees from some bizarre camping expedition were people I recognized as family members. Uncle Gerald sat slumped in a folding chair next to a massive RV that definitely hadn't been there when I left for work on July 4th. Aunt Susan was attempting to console my mother near what appeared to be a hastily assembled tent city in my front yard. Cousins I hadn't seen in years milled around looking sheepish and avoiding eye contact. Mom rushed over as soon as she saw me climb out of my truck. Linda Parker, my 62-year-old mother who taught elementary school for 35 years, and never missed church on Sunday, looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her gray hair was disheveled, her clothing wrinkled and smoky, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "Parker, honey, I'm so sorry." She began reaching for me with trembling hands. We never thought anything like this would happen. It was supposed to be a wonderful family celebration, and everything went so wrong so fast. That's when the real bombshell dropped. This wasn't some freak accident or coincidence. Through her tears and stammered explanations, the horrifying truth began to emerge. She had been planning this family reunion at my cabin for 3 months. 3 months of coordinating with relatives across 5 states, sending out invitations, organizing food and activities, all without bothering to mention it to me or ask my permission. Uncle Gerald shuffled over, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Frank Parker. My father trailed behind him with the hangdog expression he wore whenever Mom's schemes went sideways. Gerald cleared his throat and admitted they had used bolt cutters on my gate lock because they couldn't find the key I'd never given them. Frank sheepishly confirmed they had crowbarred my front door when the stolen gate key obviously didn't work on the house. "We figured you'd be thrilled to host everyone," Mom said, as if this explained everything. "You're always talking about how peaceful and beautiful it is up here. We thought you'd want to share that with the whole family." I stared at her in disbelief. You thought I'd be thrilled that you broke into my property with 24 people I didn't invite. Well, when you put it that way, it sounds bad, Uncle Gerald muttered. Cousin Derek, Linda's brother's son, who I'd always found obnoxious, even at family gatherings, had apparently been documenting the entire unauthorized celebration on Instagram. His phone was full of videos showing relatives using my personal belongings, cooking in my kitchen, and making themselves comfortable in every room of my house. The captions read things like awesome mountain party at Parker's place and family reunion vibes in the Colorado Rockies. As I walked through my violated sanctuary, the extent of the damage became clear. The kitchen was completely destroyed, with melted cabinet doors hanging at odd angles and countertops cracked from the intense heat. My carefully chosen hardwood floors were warped and stained with water and chemicals from the firefighting efforts. The custom-built reading nook where I'd spent countless peaceful hours recovering from my divorce was blackened and ruined. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the emotional violation. This place had been my refuge, the one space in the world that belonged completely to me, after my ex-wife Sarah had taken half of everything in the divorce. I'd saved for 2 years to buy this cabin, spending weekends driving up from Denver to paint and repair and make it perfect. Every piece of furniture had been carefully chosen, every decoration placed with intention. Now relatives I barely knew had made themselves at home in my sanctuary. Cousin Brenda had brought her 3 unleashed dogs who had chewed my leather furniture and left hair everywhere. Uncle Gerald's RV had leaked sewage onto my pristine lawn, creating a brown stain that would take months to repair. Aunt Patty had apparently used my expensive coffee beans to brew pot after pot for 50 people, emptying containers I'd been saving for special occasions. The fire had started when Cousin Tommy Gerald's youngest son, who I remembered as being spectacularly lacking in common sense, decided to deep fry a turkey using the indoor stove in July, because apparently outdoor cooking wasn't convenient enough for their unauthorized celebration. Insurance adjuster Janet Morrison arrived while I was still processing the scene. She was a professional woman in her 40s who had clearly seen her share of residential fires, but even she seemed taken aback by the circumstances. As she walked through the damage with her clipboard and camera, she estimated the repairs would cost at least $35,000. The good news is that the structure is sound, she told me, making notes on her tablet. The bad news is that smoke damage is extensive throughout the entire cabin. You'll need to replace most of the interior elements, including flooring, wall coverings, and ventilation systems. As Janet continued her assessment, I noticed things missing. My late grandfather's antique fishing tackle box, which I kept on the mantel as a memorial, was nowhere to be found. The divorce recovery journal, where I'd written my thoughts during the darkest period of my life, had vanished from my bedside table. My collection of handmade pottery from a local artist I'd supported was gone. "Has anyone seen an old wooden tackle box?" I asked the assembled relatives. It was sitting on the mantel in the living room. Blank stares and shrugged shoulders answered me. Uncle Gerald suggested it might have been damaged in the fire, but the mantel was in the unburned section of the cabin. Cousin Derek was suddenly very interested in his phone, scrolling through something with intense concentration. The morning sun climbed higher as the last of the firefighters packed their equipment and prepared to leave. Chief Rodriguez handed me a report number and his business card explaining that I'd need the documentation for insurance purposes. He also mentioned that because this involved forced entry to private property, I might want to consider filing a police report. "It's up to you," he said quietly, glancing at the relatives still scattered around my property. "But breaking and entering is breaking and entering, regardless of family relationships." As the fire trucks pulled away, I was left standing in the ruins of my sanctuary with 23 relatives who had violated my home, caused thousands of dollars in damage, and were now acting like I should somehow be grateful for their presence. Mom was already talking about making the best of things and turning this into a positive experience. but all I could think about was how safe and peaceful this place had felt just 48 hours ago, and how that feeling might never return. The sanctuary I'd built from the ashes of my failed marriage was now literally ashes itself, and the people responsible were my own family. The worst part was that they genuinely seemed to believe they had done nothing wrong. The week following the fire brought a systematic assault on my sanity that made the actual break-in seem almost gentle by comparison. While I dealt with insurance adjusters, contractors, and the overwhelming logistics of repairing my violated sanctuary, my family launched what could only be described as a coordinated psychological warfare campaign designed to make me question my own judgment. It started with Mom's daily phone calls. Linda would alternate between tearful apologies and subtle accusations that I was making a bigger deal out of this than necessary. According to her evolving narrative, the family had simply wanted to surprise me with their presence, and the fire was an unfortunate accident that could have happened to anyone. She seemed genuinely baffled by my anger, as if breaking into someone's property was a normal expression of family affection. "We've always been a close family, Parker," she said during one particularly manipulative conversation. "I don't understand why you're being so cold and legalistic about this. It's just a house, honey. Family is what matters. Just a house." The sanctuary that had literally saved my mental health after the divorce was just a house to the woman who had raised me. The place where I'd rebuilt my confidence and found peace was apparently just wood and nails in her estimation. Her ability to minimize my feelings while simultaneously playing the victim was breathtaking in its audacity. Uncle Gerald escalated the campaign by sending me a 2-page handwritten letter that arrived on expensive stationery, as if the formal presentation would somehow legitimize his twisted logic. He explained at length how disappointed he was in my materialistic values and my apparent inability to appreciate that the family had chosen my fancy mountain palace as the site for their celebration. According to Gerald, I should feel honored that they considered my cabin worthy of their presence. The letter went on to describe how hurt various relatives felt by my hostile reaction to their generous gesture of inclusion. He painted a picture of wounded family members who had traveled hundreds of miles just to spend time in a place that was special to me, only to be met with anger and threats of legal action, instead of gratitude and fellowship. Most insidiously, Gerald suggested that my response revealed character flaws that needed serious examination. Perhaps my divorce had made me selfish and isolated. Maybe I needed therapy to address my inability to share and connect with loved ones. The letter concluded with a prayer that I would find it in my heart to forgive their minor property mistake and remember what truly mattered in life. Aunt Susan took a different approach, entirely starting a family group chat that included everyone except me. Cousin Jessica, who had always been the most honest member of our extended family, felt uncomfortable with the exclusion and began sending me screenshots of the conversations. The messages revealed a coordinated effort to reshape the narrative and cast me as the villain in my own victimization. "Parker has always been dramatic," one aunt had written. "Remember how he overreacted when his marriage ended? He just can't handle normal family situations anymore." "The fire wasn't even that bad," Uncle Bob had contributed. "Insurance will cover everything, and we were planning to help him redecorate anyway. He's acting like we burned down a cathedral." "I think his ex-wife was right about him being controlling," Cousin Michelle had added. "No wonder Sarah left him. Who gets this upset about family wanting to visit?" The group chat revealed that several relatives were actively working to convince others that I had given some form of permission for their presence at the cabin. The story was evolving in real time, with various family members adding details about phone conversations and text messages that had never occurred. They were collectively creating a false history where I had invited them and was now suffering from some kind of mental breakdown that made me forget my own actions. The manipulation reached a new low when Mom revealed she had told Grandma Ruth that I had specifically invited the entire extended family to the cabin, then changed my mind and banned everyone after they had already arrived. Ruth, my 89-year-old grandmother, who was sharp as a tack despite her age, was now confused and deeply hurt by what she perceived as a personal rejection. "She doesn't understand why you invited her and then told her to leave," Mom explained with practiced innocence. "It's breaking her heart, Parker. She keeps asking what she did wrong to make you angry with her." At her age, this kind of emotional stress could be really dangerous. The weaponization of my beloved grandmother felt like a knife to the chest. Ruth had been the one stable, loving presence throughout my childhood, and the thought of her suffering because of this situation was almost unbearable. Mom knew exactly how much Ruth meant to me, and she was deliberately using that bond to manipulate my responses. Several aunts and uncles began posting passive-aggressive messages on social media about family members who choose possessions over people and the importance of forgiveness in maintaining family bonds. While they never mentioned me by name, everyone who knew our family understood exactly who they were targeting. Friends began asking me awkward questions about why I was so upset about family visiting and whether I was okay emotionally. Cousin Derek absolutely refused to remove his Instagram posts documenting their unauthorized celebration. He claimed the videos and photos were happy family memories that everyone should be able to enjoy forever. When I pointed out that they were evidence of criminal behavior, he laughed and suggested I needed to chill out and stop being so paranoid about social media. The posts were still gaining views and comments, with Derek's friends asking why I was so uptight about family and whether I had control issues. The comments section became a public forum for discussing my supposed character defects, with people who had never met me offering opinions about my mental health and relationship skills. The psychological pressure intensified when my ex-wife Sarah called out of the blue. She'd seen some of the social media drama and wanted to check on my well-being, but her concern came with uncomfortable observations about my family's behavior patterns. Sarah admitted that my family's boundary issues had been a significant factor in our marriage problems, something she'd tried to discuss during our relationship, but I'd been too loyal to acknowledge. "They've always treated you like their personal possession," she said gently. "Remember how your mom used to just show up at our apartment without calling? Or how your uncle would borrow your tools without asking, and then get offended when you wanted them back? This cabin thing is just the same pattern on a bigger scale." Hearing Sarah validate my concerns felt like a lifeline, but it also forced me to confront how long I'd been enabling my family's boundary violations. Their casual disregard for my autonomy wasn't new. It had just escalated to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. The realization that my own family had been systematically undermining my relationships and personal boundaries for years was devastating. Meanwhile, insurance complications emerged when adjuster Janet Morrison discovered the forced entry during her detailed investigation. Company policy potentially voided coverage for damages resulting from criminal activity on the property, regardless of the relationship between the policyholder and the perpetrators. I was facing the possibility of eating $35,000 in repair costs because my family had decided to break into my home. "We've seen this before," Janet explained diplomatically. "Family disputes that result in property damage can be complicated from a coverage standpoint. You might want to consider consulting with an attorney about your options." The irony wasn't lost on me. My family's attempt to force their way into my life was potentially going to bankrupt me, and they were simultaneously running a campaign to convince everyone that I was the unreasonable party in this situation. They had violated my sanctuary, caused massive damage, stolen my possessions, and were now gaslighting me into believing that my anger was inappropriate. But the most painful realization was that this coordinated manipulation campaign revealed who my family really was when their actions had consequences. Instead of taking responsibility, they had chosen to attack my character and rewrite history to protect themselves. The people I'd loved and trusted my entire life were perfectly willing to sacrifice my mental health and financial security to avoid acknowledging their wrongdoing. As I sat in my hotel room that night, scrolling through screenshots of family members discussing my supposed psychological problems, I finally understood what Sarah had been trying to tell me during our marriage. My family didn't see me as an individual with rights and boundaries. I was just an extension of them, and my attempt to maintain independence was being treated like a rebellious teenager acting out against loving parents. The sanctuary they had destroyed wasn't just my cabin. It was my entire understanding of what family meant. By the second week of dealing with my family's coordinated gaslighting campaign, I realized I needed professional help to document what had actually happened at my cabin. The insurance complications were mounting, and my family's shifting stories were making it impossible to establish a clear timeline of events. Against my natural instincts to handle family problems privately, I hired private investigator Marcus Thompson to gather evidence for both insurance claims and potential legal action. Marcus was a former Denver police detective in his early 50s who specialized in financial crimes and domestic investigations. His calm, methodical approach to gathering facts was exactly what I needed to cut through the emotional manipulation and establish objective truth about the situation. What he discovered in his first week of investigation was far worse than anything I had imagined possible. The initial focus was documenting evidence of the break-in and cataloging property damage for insurance purposes. Marcus obtained security footage from a neighbor's hunting camera that covered part of my driveway, interviewed witnesses, and began tracking down my missing possessions. But as he dug deeper into the family dynamics and financial relationships, disturbing patterns began to emerge. "Your family has more secrets than you know," Marcus told me. During our first major update meeting, "The cabin situation is just the tip of an iceberg that goes down pretty deep." Through public record searches and financial database queries, Marcus discovered that Uncle Gerald and Aunt Susan had been systematically draining Grandma Ruth's savings accounts for at least 18 months. The pattern was sophisticated and deliberate, involving redirected Social Security deposits, unauthorized credit card usage, and forged signatures on bank documents. Gerald had used Ruth's credit cards to finance his RV purchase, the same vehicle that had leaked sewage all over my lawn during their unauthorized celebration. Susan had been redirecting Ruth's Social Security checks to her own bank account, telling Ruth that direct deposit was temporarily unavailable while she handled the problem. Multiple relatives had been visiting Ruth's house regularly under the guise of helping her downsize, systematically removing valuable items that were later sold online. The total financial theft appears to be in the $70,000 range so far, Marcus explained, showing me spreadsheets that documented the systematic abuse. But the emotional manipulation might be even worse than the money. Mom had known about the financial abuse but had chosen to stay silent to avoid family conflict. She'd been receiving regular updates from Gerald and Susan about their management of Ruth's affairs, and she'd participated in the cover-up by discouraging Ruth from asking too many questions about her missing money and possessions. The hunting camera footage from my neighbor's property revealed the true nature of my family's attitude toward their criminal behavior. The videos showed relatives laughing and joking about "Parker will never know" as they carried my belongings to their vehicles. Gerald could be clearly heard saying, "He owes us this after Ruth's been so generous," while directing the unloading of camping equipment. Most damaging was footage of Derek pocketing my grandfather's antique fishing tackle box, while other relatives laughed about Parker's precious stuff. The audio revealed relatives mocking my attachment to sentimental objects and discussing how spoiled I was for caring about material possessions. "They weren't just stealing from you," Marcus observed. "They were actively mocking you while they did it." But Marcus's most devastating discovery involved the true purpose behind the July 5th celebration. The family reunion hadn't been planned as a genuine gathering at all. Gerald and Susan had needed to get Ruth out of her house for several days while they completed the final phase of their theft operation, removing the last valuable furniture items and clearing out her safety deposit box. The cabin break-in was essentially a distraction operation. By convincing my mom to coordinate the family gathering, Gerald and Susan created a cover story that would keep Ruth occupied and confused while they finished looting her home. They'd specifically chosen my cabin because they knew I wouldn't be there, and because my reaction to their presence would create enough family drama to overshadow their other activities. This was never about family bonding, Marcus explained. It was about creating chaos to cover up elder abuse. The investigation revealed that Ruth had early-stage dementia, a condition that Gerald and Susan had been deliberately hiding from the rest of the family. They'd been using her confusion to manipulate her into signing documents she didn't understand and agreeing to financial arrangements that benefited only them. Her doctor's notes showed she'd been expressing concerns about missing money and family taking things for months, but Gerald and Susan had dismissed these worries as dementia confusion. Ruth's supposed heartbreak over my rejection of the family gathering was actually disorientation caused by deliberate misinformation. Gerald and Susan had told her multiple conflicting stories about why she was staying at the cabin who had invited her and why she couldn't go home. Her distress wasn't about family rejection. It was about being systematically lied to by people she trusted. "Your grandmother has been trying to tell people what was happening to her," Marcus said gently. But everyone assumed her concerns were just age-related confusion. The scope of the elder abuse was staggering. Marcus found evidence of forged signatures on legal documents, unauthorized medical decisions, and systematic isolation from friends who might have noticed the financial irregularities. Gerald and Susan had been working methodically to gain complete control over Ruth's life, while making it appear that she was receiving loving family care. Several other relatives had been recruited as unwitting accomplices through a combination of lies and small financial incentives. They'd been told that Ruth was becoming difficult and paranoid about money, and that Gerald and Susan were heroically managing her affairs to protect her from scammers and bad decisions. The family members who'd participated in the guilt campaign against me genuinely believed they were defending Ruth's loving caregivers against her ungrateful grandson. "The manipulation goes both ways," Marcus explained. "They've been lying to Ruth about you and lying to other family members about Ruth." Mom's participation in the cover-up was motivated by a combination of willful blindness and fear of losing her inheritance. She'd known something was wrong with Ruth's financial situation, but had chosen to believe Gerald and Susan's explanations rather than investigating further. Her coordination of the cabin celebration was partly genuine family enthusiasm and partly deliberate distraction from activities she didn't want to examine too closely. The evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking. My beloved grandmother had been systematically victimized by her own children, while the rest of the family either participated in the abuse or looked the other way. The violation of my cabin was just one small piece of a much larger pattern of criminal behavior that had been destroying Ruth's life for over a year. But Marcus saved the most shocking revelation for last. During his investigation into Ruth's financial records, he discovered that she had secretly updated her emergency contact information 6 months earlier, removing Gerald and Susan and listing me as her primary contact. She'd apparently suspected something was wrong, but hadn't known how to address the situation directly. She was trying to protect herself, Marcus told me, and she was trying to protect you. Ruth's lucid moments were more frequent and meaningful than anyone realized. She'd been documenting concerns about missing possessions and unauthorized financial transactions, but Gerald and Susan had been intercepting her attempts to seek help. She'd tried calling me several times, but they'd told her I was too busy with work to be bothered with her problems. The investigation revealed that my family's guilt campaign against me served a dual purpose: discrediting me as a potential witness to their abuse and maintaining their cover story about the cabin gathering being a legitimate family celebration. By painting me as selfish and mentally unstable, They were proactively undermining my credibility if I ever discovered what they were really doing to Ruth. They needed you to look like the bad guy, Marcus summarized, because they knew eventually someone would start asking questions about what was happening to your grandmother. As I absorbed the full scope of my family's betrayal, I realized that the cabin break-in was actually the least of their crimes. They had been systematically destroying an elderly woman's life while using family loyalty as a weapon against anyone who might interfere with their operations. The fire that had brought me rushing to my violated sanctuary was just the moment when their carefully constructed deception finally became visible. The people I had loved and trusted my entire life weren't just boundary-violating relatives with poor judgment. They were criminals who had been using family relationships to commit elder abuse on an appalling scale. And my attachment to my grandmother made me a threat to their operations that needed to be neutralized. Everything I thought I knew about my family had been a lie. Armed with Marcus's devastating evidence, I drove straight to the offices of elder law attorney Rebecca Foster, whose name had been recommended by 3 different advocacy organizations. Rebecca was a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in cases involving financial abuse of elderly victims, and her initial reaction to Marcus's documentation was both professional outrage and grim familiarity. "This is one of the more systematic elder abuse operations I've seen," she said after reviewing the evidence files. "But you have something most victims don't have: comprehensive documentation and a clear timeline of criminal activity." Rebecca explained that my legal position was stronger than I dared to hope. Ruth's secret update of her emergency contact information gave me standing to act on her behalf, and the extensive evidence of financial crimes provided multiple avenues for both criminal prosecution and civil recovery. The cabin break-in, while emotionally devastating, was actually the smallest legal issue we'd be addressing. "Your family made a critical error when they documented their crimes so thoroughly," Rebecca observed, reviewing Derek's Instagram posts and the hunting camera footage. "Most elder abuse cases are difficult to prove because they happen behind closed doors. Your relatives filmed themselves committing felonies and posted the evidence online." Within 48 hours, Rebecca had filed a comprehensive legal assault that hit my criminal family members from multiple directions simultaneously. Criminal charges for breaking and entering my cabin went to the district attorney's office, along with detailed evidence packages. Elder abuse charges against Gerald and Susan went to the state attorney general's office, trussed with Marcus's financial documentation. Emergency protective orders for Ruth were filed in probate court, with medical evidence of her dementia and the systematic abuse. The legal system moved with surprising speed once presented with clear evidence of ongoing elder abuse. Within 72 hours, police arrested Gerald and Susan on felony charges, including financial exploitation of an at-risk adult, identity theft, and forgery. Gerald's RV was impounded as evidence after investigators discovered storage compartments full of items stolen from both Ruth and my cabin. Derek was arrested the same day when police found my grandfather's antique fishing tackle box in his apartment, along with several other items that had disappeared from my cabin during the unauthorized celebration. His Instagram posts became evidence of his participation in a criminal enterprise, and his casual documentation of theft became the foundation for additional burglary charges. Judge Patricia Williams reviewed our emergency petition for protective custody of Ruth and granted temporary guardianship within a week. Ruth was immediately moved from Gerald and Susan's care to a secure memory facility where she could receive proper medical attention without interference from family members who had been exploiting her condition. "The evidence of systematic abuse is overwhelming," Judge Williams stated during the hearing. "This court finds clear and convincing evidence that the alleged perpetrators pose an ongoing danger to the proposed ward's physical and financial well-being." The first visit to Ruth in her new facility was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Away from the constant pressure and manipulation of Gerald and Susan, she seemed calmer and more lucid than I'd seen her in months. The nursing staff reported that she'd been asking repeatedly about missing money and possessions concerns that had been dismissed as dementia paranoia by her previous caretakers. They kept telling me I was confused, Ruth said during one of her clear moments, holding my hand with surprising strength. But I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to make anyone listen. The family's reaction to the arrests was swift and predictable. Mom called me sobbing, accusing me of destroying the family and choosing strangers over blood relatives. Uncle Bob hired a lawyer to contest Ruth's guardianship, claiming I was mentally unstable and vindictive after the cabin incident. "You're tearing this family apart over money," Mom wailed during one particularly emotional phone call. "Gerald and Susan made some mistakes, but you're sending them to prison. How can you live with yourself?" The irony of Mom accusing me of caring too much about money while defending relatives who had stolen $70,000 from an elderly woman was breathtaking. But her tears were genuine even if her understanding of the situation was completely distorted by years of enabling abuse and avoiding uncomfortable truths. Several relatives attempted to mount a defense fund for Gerald, and Susan soliciting contributions from extended family members who still believed the cover stories about misunderstandings and accounting errors. The fundraising efforts collapsed when Rebecca released carefully selected portions of the evidence to demonstrate the systematic nature of the crimes. Financial exploitation isn't a mistake, Rebecca explained to reporters who picked up the story. It's a deliberate criminal enterprise that destroys vulnerable people's lives. The evidence in this case shows planning coordination and complete disregard for the victim's well-being. Insurance adjuster Janet Morrison called with good news for the first time in weeks. Once criminal charges were filed, documenting the forced entry, my policy coverage was restored. The company would cover all repair costs for the cabin damage, and they were pursuing their own legal action against the perpetrators for recovery of their expenses. $35,000 in damages plus our investigation costs, Janet explained. Your family is looking at significant civil liability on top of their criminal charges. But the most satisfying development was the systematic collapse of my family's gaslighting campaign as the evidence became public. Relatives who had spent weeks telling me I was overreacting to minor property damage suddenly found themselves confronted with documentation of systematic elder abuse, identity theft, and financial crimes spanning 18 months. Cousin Jessica called to apologize for participating in the group chat attacks on my character. "I had no idea what Gerald and Susan were really doing," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "They made it sound like Ruth was getting confused about normal family financial help." Several other relatives quietly reached out to express similar sentiments, admitting they'd been manipulated into believing Gerald and Susan's version of events. The social media posts questioning my mental health and family loyalty disappeared as quickly as they'd appeared, replaced by embarrassed silence from relatives who realized they'd been defending criminals. Derek's employer terminated his position after his arrest made local news, and several of his friends posted public apologies for their comments mocking my uptight response to the cabin break-in. The Instagram posts that had been presented as evidence of happy family memories were now being used in court as documentation of criminal behavior. It's amazing how quickly public opinion changes when people see actual evidence, Marcus observed during one of our update meetings. Your family was counting on the story never being challenged. The legal victories were comprehensive and satisfying, but the emotional healing would take much longer. Every document Rebecca filed, every arrest warrant executed, and every protective order granted represented the systematic destruction of relationships I'd cherished my entire life. I was protecting Ruth and seeking justice, but I was also acknowledging that my family was fundamentally different from what I'd always believed them to be. Gerald's lawyer attempted to negotiate a plea bargain that would avoid prison time in exchange for full restitution and community service. Rebecca's response was swift and uncompromising full prosecution on all charges, maximum sentences, and complete financial recovery for all victims. Elder abuse is a serious crime with serious consequences, she told the defense attorney. Your clients systematically destroyed an elderly woman's financial security while using family relationships to prevent detection. This court needs to send a message that such behavior will not be tolerated. As I sat in Rebecca's office reviewing the latest legal filings, I realized that the scared, confused man who'd driven through the night to find his cabin burning had been transformed into someone much stronger and more determined. My family had tried to destroy my sanctuary and gaslight me into accepting their abuse, but they'd actually given me something much more valuable, absolute clarity about who they really were and what I needed to do to protect the people I genuinely loved. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since that midnight phone call, I was confident that justice would prevail. As the legal proceedings gained momentum and the evidence of systematic elder abuse became undeniable, I began spending regular time with Ruth at her new memory care facility. Away from the constant pressure and manipulation of Gerald and Susan, she experienced longer periods of lucidity and seemed genuinely relieved to be in a safe environment where her concerns were taken seriously rather than dismissed as confusion. During one particularly clear afternoon in early September, Ruth asked me to sit beside her bed and listen carefully to something important she needed to tell me. What she revealed in that quiet room fundamentally changed my understanding of everything that had happened over the past year. I've been more aware than anyone realized. She began, her voice steady and determined. Gerald and Susan thought my dementia was worse than it actually is, and I let them believe that because I was trying to figure out how to protect myself. Ruth explained that she'd been deliberately excluding me from recent family gatherings because she suspected Gerald and Susan were planning something that would somehow involve my cabin. She'd overheard phone conversations about using Parker's place and getting him out of the way, but hadn't been able to piece together their complete scheme. I changed my emergency contacts to you because you're the only one I trust to handle my affairs honestly, she continued. Everyone else is either stealing from me or too scared to stop the people who are. The most shocking revelation came when Ruth told me about a safety deposit box she'd maintained secretly at a different bank from her primary accounts. For over a year, she'd been methodically documenting the theft and manipulation she was experiencing, photographing items before they disappeared, and saving copies of suspicious paperwork that Gerald and Susan thought they'd destroyed. I knew they were stealing, but I needed proof, she said, with the clear-eyed determination of the former bank manager she'd been for 30 years. I've been gathering evidence the whole time, waiting for someone I could trust to help me stop them. The next morning, Ruth and I visited First National Bank with Rebecca Foster and a court order authorizing access to the safety deposit box. What we found inside was a prosecutor's dream: 43 pieces of meticulously organized evidence documenting 18 months of systematic elder abuse. Ruth had photographed valuable items in her house before they disappeared, including my grandfather's military medals that Gerald had secretly sold online. She'd saved original copies of financial documents that Gerald and Susan had altered or forged. Most damaging were audio recordings she'd made on a small digital recorder, capturing conversations where Gerald and Susan discussed manipulating her medications to increase her confusion and discussed strategies for preventing family members from visiting her independently. She was conducting her own investigation, Rebecca marveled as we reviewed the evidence. This is some of the most comprehensive documentation of elder abuse I've ever seen. The recordings revealed Gerald and Susan's complete contempt for Ruth as a person and their detailed planning for exploiting her condition. They discussed timing her confused periods to coincide with important financial decisions, and they laughed about her attempts to maintain independence and dignity. The old bat keeps asking about her jewelry box, Susan could be heard saying on one recording. I told her she already gave it to me for safekeeping, but she doesn't remember agreeing to that. Gerald's voice responded with cruel laughter. Just keep telling her she's forgetting things. The more confused she gets, the easier this becomes. The evidence in Ruth's safety deposit box destroyed any remaining possibility of plea bargains or reduced charges. When confronted with recordings of their own voices discussing criminal activities, Gerald immediately accepted full responsibility and agreed to testify against Susan in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence. He received 5 years in state prison and was ordered to pay $72,000 in restitution. Susan attempted to maintain her innocence until the very end, claiming she'd been manipulated by Gerald and was just trying to help Ruth manage her affairs. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before convicting her on all charges. She received 3 years in prison and was ordered to pay $45,000 in restitution. Derek's case was somewhat different because his involvement had been primarily opportunistic rather than systematic. His theft of my possessions during the cabin break-in was clearly documented, but he hadn't been part of the elder abuse operation. He received 2 years of probation, 6 months of community service at elder care facilities, and a permanent criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. Sometimes the best punishment is living with the consequences of your choices, Rebecca observed, as we watched Derek begin his community service. He's young enough that this experience might actually teach him something valuable about respecting other people. The broader family's reaction to the convictions was a mixture of shock, denial, and gradual acceptance of realities they'd been avoiding for months. Several relatives who had participated in the gaslighting campaign against me quietly contacted me to apologize, admitting they'd been manipulated into believing Gerald and Susan's version of events. Cousin Michelle, who had started the unauthorized online fundraiser for Parker's cabin repairs, sent a heartfelt letter explaining how she'd been deceived about the true nature of the situation. "I thought Gerald and Susan were saints for taking care of Ruth," she wrote. "I had no idea they were stealing from her while making the rest of us believe they were sacrifices." Uncle Bob, who had threatened to disown me if I pursued legal action, gradually came to terms with the evidence against his siblings. His anger shifted from defending Gerald and Susan to fury at being made an unwitting accomplice to their crimes. He genuinely believed he was supporting loving caregivers against an ungrateful grandson. "They played all of us," he admitted during a difficult phone conversation. "They made us into weapons against you while they robbed our mother blind." Mom's transformation was the most complex and painful to witness. Linda had to confront not only the reality of what Gerald and Susan had done, but also her own role in enabling their abuse through willful blindness and conflict avoidance. The therapy she entered was intensive and focused on understanding how her fear of family confrontation had contributed to Ruth's victimization. "I knew something was wrong," she confessed during one of our carefully supervised conversations. "But I told myself that questioning Gerald and Susan would cause more problems than it would solve. I chose family peace over Ruth's safety, and that choice nearly destroyed her." Linda's genuine remorse and commitment to change gradually earned my cautious forgiveness, but our relationship would never return to its previous unconditional trust. She demonstrated that her need to maintain family harmony was stronger than her commitment to protecting vulnerable members, and that knowledge would always inform our future interactions. The most satisfying development was Ruth's improvement once she was free from constant manipulation and abuse. Her dementia symptoms stabilized rather than progressing, leading her doctors to conclude that much of her apparent confusion had been artificially induced by stress medication interference and systematic gaslighting. "She's actually doing remarkably well for someone her age," Dr. Elizabeth Warner explained during a family meeting. "The cognitive decline we were seeing appears to have been largely situational rather than organic. In a stable, supportive environment, she's maintained most of her mental faculties. Ruth's lucid periods became more frequent and longer lasting as she recovered from the emotional trauma of being systematically victimized by her own children. She began participating in facility activities, made friends with other residents, and started talking about plans for her remaining years that focused on dignity and autonomy rather than just surviving another day. "I feel like myself again," she told me during one of our weekly visits. "For the first time in 2 years, I'm not constantly worried about what's going to disappear next or who's lying to me about what." As the criminal cases concluded and the family slowly began processing the full scope of what had happened, I realized that the cabin fire had been a blessing in disguise. Without that dramatic catalyst, Gerald and Susan's systematic abuse of Ruth might have continued for years until she was completely incapacitated or deceased. The violation of my sanctuary had led directly to the protection of someone I loved more than any physical space or possession. The fire that had destroyed my reading nook had illuminated crimes that were destroying Ruth's life, and my family's attempt to gaslight me into accepting their behavior had ultimately exposed the full extent of their criminal enterprise. Justice had been served, but more importantly, Ruth was safe and free to live her remaining years with dignity rather than fear. With the criminal convictions finalized and civil restitution orders in place, I could finally focus on rebuilding both my cabin and my relationship with Ruth. The insurance settlement, combined with the court-ordered payments from Gerald and Susan, provided enough funding to restore my sanctuary to an even better condition than it had been before the fire. I spent the autumn months working with contractors to redesign the damaged areas, while preserving the peaceful atmosphere that had made the cabin special in the first place. The new kitchen featured better ventilation and fire safety equipment, while the living room was rebuilt with windows that offered improved views of the surrounding mountains. Most meaningfully, I created a memorial corner dedicated to my grandfather, using his recovered fishing tackle box, which had been returned as evidence after Derek's conviction. The memorial corner became a place of reflection, rather than just remembrance. Every time I looked at those antique lures and hand-carved reels, I was reminded that integrity and courage could be passed between generations, even when they skipped some family members. My grandfather would have been proud of the stand I'd taken to protect Ruth, even though it required confronting his own children's criminal behavior. Ruth's condition continued to stabilize and improve in her secure facility environment. Free from constant manipulation and stress, her dementia symptoms plateaued rather than progressing, and her doctors were cautiously optimistic about her long-term prognosis. More importantly, Ruth seemed genuinely happy for the first time in years. During one of our regular visits in late October, Ruth asked me to sit close so she could share something private and important. Her eyes were clearer and more focused than I'd seen them since before Gerald and Susan began their systematic abuse. "I need to tell you about some decisions I've made." She began, taking my hand in both of hers. "I've been thinking very clearly about what I want to happen with everything I still have left." Ruth explained that she'd spent weeks working with her court-appointed advocate and estate planning attorney to rewrite her will completely. After witnessing how I'd handled the crisis with integrity and focus on her well-being rather than personal gain, she'd decided to leave me her entire estate, including the family farm in Nebraska that had been in our family for 4 generations. "You're the only one who protected me without asking what was in it for you," she said with quiet conviction. "Gerald and Susan stole from me, while Linda looked the other way, and everyone else stayed silent. But you risked your relationships with the entire family to keep me safe." The family farm represented far more than just property value, though Ruth's estate was worth approximately $400,000 total. The 200-acre spread had been homesteaded by my great-great-grandfather and had supported 4 generations of our family through good times and difficult ones. Ruth's decision to entrust it to me felt like both an incredible honor and a profound responsibility. But Ruth had an even bigger vision for the property than just family inheritance. During her months of recovery, she'd been thinking about ways to transform her experience of victimization into protection for other elderly people facing similar abuse. She asked me to consider using the farm as the foundation for a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping elder abuse survivors. Turn this pain into purpose, she said, her voice strengthening with enthusiasm for the project. Create a place where other people like me can be safe while they rebuild their lives and fight back against the people who hurt them. The idea resonated deeply with everything I'd learned about elder abuse during the legal proceedings. Rebecca Foster had explained that most victims never receive justice because they lack the resources and support systems necessary to challenge their abusers effectively. A residential facility that provided temporary housing, legal advocacy, and counseling services could fill a critical gap in elder protection services. I spent the winter months researching nonprofit law and elder advocacy strategies while continuing to visit Ruth regularly and manage the final details of the criminal restitution process. Ruth's enthusiasm for the project gave her a sense of purpose that seemed to energize her recovery and provide motivation for staying as healthy and lucid as possible. Several relatives attempted reconciliation as word spread about Ruth's new will and my potential inheritance. Cousins who had participated in the character assassination campaign during the early weeks after the fire suddenly wanted to repair relationships and move past the unfortunate misunderstandings that had divided the family. I maintained polite but firm boundaries with most of these overtures. The people who had defended elder abuse and attacked my character when they thought I was motivated by property concerns weren't suddenly trustworthy now that I actually stood to inherit significant assets. Their timing revealed everything about their true motivations and nothing about genuine remorse for their actions. Mom's situation was more complex and emotionally charged. Linda had completed 6 months of intensive therapy focused on understanding how her conflict avoidance and people-pleasing tendencies had enabled abuse. Her growth seemed genuine, but rebuilding trust would require consistent actions over time, rather than just insights and apologies. I understand if you never fully trust me again, she said during one of our carefully structured conversations. I failed Ruth when she needed protection, and I failed you when you were being attacked for doing what I should have done myself. Her acknowledgement of responsibility was a necessary first step, but it couldn't erase the memory of her choosing family peace over Ruth's safety when the choice mattered most. She'd have to demonstrate through years of different behavior that she'd truly changed her priorities and decision-making processes. The cabin restoration was completed in early December, almost exactly 5 months after the fire that had started this entire ordeal. Standing in my rebuilt sanctuary, I felt a complex mixture of peace and transformation. The space was beautiful and functional again, but I was no longer the same person who had fled here to recover from his divorce. The man who had used this cabin as an escape from family complications had become someone willing to fight family battles when vulnerable people needed protection. The sanctuary that had been violated by criminal relatives was now the foundation for planning a much larger sanctuary dedicated to protecting other victims of similar crimes. My relationship with the cabin had evolved from personal refuge to launching pad for public service. Ruth's gift hadn't just given me property and responsibility, it had given me a mission that transformed my experience of victimization into a tool for helping others facing similar challenges. As Christmas approached, Ruth and I began making specific plans for the nonprofit organization that would bear her name. The Ruth Henderson Center for Elder Protection would officially launch in the spring, offering residential support, legal advocacy, and counseling services for elderly people escaping abuse situations. I never imagined that Gerald and Susan's crimes would lead to something this positive. Ruth observed during one of our planning sessions, maybe this is how healing really works. You take what was meant to destroy you and use it to protect other people. Her wisdom and resilience continued to amaze me. The woman who had been systematically victimized by her own children had not only survived the experience, but was using it as the foundation for helping others. Ruth's transformation from victim to advocate provided a powerful model for the kind of recovery and empowerment the center would offer to its future residents. The memorial corner in my rebuilt cabin now included photographs of the farm and architectural plans for the center. My grandfather's fishing tackle represented the family legacy of integrity and courage, while Ruth's project plans represented the family legacy of service and protection that we were building for future generations. Standing in that peaceful space, surrounded by evidence of both destruction and renewal, I finally understood what my family crisis had been teaching me. True strength wasn't about building walls to keep difficulties out. It was about building bridges to help other people cross over their own difficult waters safely. The sanctuary they had tried to destroy had become the birthplace of a much larger sanctuary dedicated to justice and healing. 18 months after that terrifying midnight phone call that shattered my peaceful life, I stood in the main building of the Ruth Henderson Center for Elder Protection, watching our first residents settle into their temporary homes while they rebuilt their lives and fought for justice against their abusers. The irony brought me deep peace. My family's attempt to violate my sanctuary had led directly to creating a sanctuary that would protect countless vulnerable elderly people for generations to come. Ruth had passed away peacefully in her sleep 6 months earlier, lucid and content until the very end. Her final words to me were gratitude that I had chosen protection over revenge, integrity over family pressure, and truth over comfortable lies. She died knowing that her legacy would serve justice rather than enable the kind of abuse that had nearly destroyed her final years. "You turned my suffering into something beautiful," she'd whispered during our last conversation. "That's the greatest gift anyone could give an old woman who thought her life was ending in shame and fear." The Ruth Henderson Center officially opened in April, utilizing both the family farm property and additional facilities we'd built, using the proceeds from civil judgments against Gerald and Susan. The center offered temporary housing for up to 20 elderly abuse survivors at a time, along with comprehensive legal advocacy counseling services and family mediation programs designed to address the complex dynamics that enable elder abuse. Our partnership network included elder law attorneys, social workers, financial advisors, and investigators who understood the sophisticated tactics used by family members to exploit vulnerable elderly relatives. We'd helped 43 families navigate abuse situations in our first year of operation, with a 97% success rate in securing protective orders and financial restitution for victims. Gerald and Susan continued serving their prison sentences while paying court-ordered restitution that funded the center's daily operations. Their appeals had been denied, and their sentences stood as permanent reminders that family relationships don't excuse criminal behavior. Derek had completed his community service at elder care facilities, and the experience had genuinely changed his perspective on respecting vulnerable people's autonomy and dignity. I never realized how much damage we were doing," he'd said during a supervised meeting where he apologized for his role in the cabin break-in and harassment campaign. "Working with elderly people every day for 6 months showed me how scared and helpless Ruth must have felt while we were stealing from her and mocking her concerns." Derek's transformation was one of the few genuinely positive family outcomes from our crisis. His criminal record and community service experience had motivated him to change careers, and he now worked as an advocate for elderly people's rights. His social media skills were redirected toward raising awareness about elder abuse warning signs rather than documenting criminal activities. Mom had earned my cautious forgiveness through 18 months of therapy, changed behavior, and consistent support for both Ruth before her death and the center afterward. Linda now served as one of the center's family education coordinators, sharing her story of how enabling behavior and conflict avoidance can contribute to systematic abuse. "I thought I was keeping the peace," she told families during our educational workshops, "but I was actually keeping secrets that allowed criminals to hurt someone I loved." Peace that protects abusers isn't real peace. It's just cowardice dressed up as family loyalty. Her work with other families facing similar dynamics was genuinely helpful and seemed to provide meaningful redemption for her role in enabling Ruth's abuse. Our relationship would never return to unconditional trust, but it had evolved into something more honest and reality-based than the naive family loyalty that had nearly enabled Ruth's destruction. My cabin continued serving as my personal retreat, but it had also become a place where I hosted monthly healing weekends for adult children who'd faced family betrayal and abuse. The memorial corner dedicated to my grandfather reminded everyone that integrity and courage could be passed between generations, while the center's planning documents demonstrated how pain could be transformed into protection for others. The legal victories had been comprehensive and satisfying. Gerald received 5 years in prison and was ordered to pay $72,000 in restitution. Susan received 3 years in prison and $45,000 in restitution. Derek received probation community service and a permanent criminal record. Multiple relatives faced smaller penalties for participating in the harassment and gaslighting campaign. But the personal victory was even more meaningful than the legal one. I'd learned to distinguish between family and people who act like family. True family protects vulnerable members, respects boundaries, and chooses truth over convenience. The relatives who apologized for their behavior and demonstrated changed actions earned cautious trust. Those who continued making excuses for abuse remained permanently estranged. Uncle Bob and several cousins had gradually recognized the full scope of Gerald and Susan's crimes and offered genuine apologies for their role in defending the abuse. These relationships were slowly rebuilding based on honest acknowledgement of past mistakes rather than demands for automatic forgiveness based on blood relations. "Family isn't about DNA," Ruth had told me during one of her lucid moments. "It's about how you treat each other when someone is vulnerable and can't protect themselves. Blood relatives who exploit weakness aren't family. Strangers who offer protection and dignity are." Her wisdom guided the center's approach to family dynamics and helped many residents understand that cutting ties with abusive relatives wasn't betrayal. It was self-preservation and often the first step toward genuine healing. I'd also found unexpected personal happiness through the center's work. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the legal advocate who coordinated our court support services, had become my romantic partner as we worked together to help elderly abuse survivors navigate the justice system. Our relationship was built on shared values of protection and service rather than just attraction, creating the kind of deep partnership I'd never experienced before. Sarah understood the importance of boundaries, the difference between enabling and supporting, and the courage required to stand up to family pressure. When vulnerable people needed protection, she'd seen too many cases where well-meaning relatives chose family peace over victim safety, and she respected the difficult choices I'd made during our crisis. The center's success had attracted national attention from elder advocacy organizations and law enforcement agencies, seeking to improve their response to family-based financial abuse. We'd been featured in congressional hearings on elder protection and had consulted with other organizations attempting to replicate our residential model in different states. But the most meaningful feedback came from the families we'd served directly. Maria Santos, an 86-year-old woman whose son had been stealing her Social Security benefits, wrote a letter that I kept framed in the center's main office. Her granddaughter had used our resources to stop the abuse and secure protective custody, giving Maria the safety and dignity she deserved in her final years. You turned your family's cruelty into kindness for strangers, Maria had written. That's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen anyone do with their pain. Her words reminded me of Ruth's final lesson. Justice isn't about revenge, it's about protection. By standing up to my family's abuse, I hadn't just protected Ruth and myself. I'd created a model that dozens of other families had used to protect their own vulnerable members from similar exploitation. The story that began with a midnight phone call about my burning cabin had evolved into something far more significant than personal vindication. It had become a testament to the truth that families are defined by their actions toward the most vulnerable members, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable the people who claim to love you. Standing in Ruth's memory garden behind the center's main building, surrounded by flowers she'd chosen and benches dedicated to other elderly abuse survivors, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from transforming suffering into service. The sanctuary my criminal relatives had tried to destroy had become the seed for a much larger sanctuary that would protect vulnerable people long after all of us were gone. The midnight phone call that had shattered my peaceful life had ultimately led to a peace far deeper than anything I'd found in isolation. True peace comes not from avoiding family problems, but from having the courage to address them honestly when vulnerable people need protection. As I read through thank you letters from families we'd helped and planning documents for expanding our services to 3 additional states, I realized that Gerald and Susan's attempt to exploit their elderly mother had backfired in ways they could never have imagined. Their crimes hadn't just resulted in prison sentences, they'd created a legacy of protection that would help thousands of vulnerable elderly people for decades to come. Ruth's wisdom, my grandfather's integrity, and my own hard-won courage had combined to create something beautiful and lasting from what was meant to be a story of exploitation and family destruction. The memorial corner in my cabin now included photographs of center residents who'd found safety and justice through the programs Ruth had envisioned during her darkest hours. Have you ever had to choose between keeping family peace and protecting someone vulnerable? How did you find the courage to do what was right even when it was difficult? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening to this story and for supporting the work we do to protect elderly people from abuse. If this story helped you understand the importance of standing up to family members who exploit vulnerable people, please like this video, subscribe to stay updated on more stories of justice and healing, and share it with others who might benefit from knowing they're not alone in facing these difficult family dynamics. Remember that true family is defined by protection, not just blood relations, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable the people who claim to love you.